NZXT are no stranger to creating different products within the PC DIY space, and for the last 5 years, they've had a new board for every generation of Intel chipset. It was only last year that they released a board on AMD, and every time a new board has been released, we've seen them up their game a bit, from switching OEM to making better and more practical design choices. And while they aren't always the first to the party, it's always nice to see something new, fresh, and more importantly, unique. Now, keeping with that, and today sees the launch of not one, but two Z690 based boards. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
I wish these files would transfer faster. Come on! Whoa, is that the FireCuda 510 NVMe drive with its blistering fast speeds of 3450 megabytes a second read, 3200 megabytes a second write, and capacities of up to 2 terabyte? I can have these files transferred in no time. And if I'm looking for the ultimate performance, I could even get the 4th generation FireCuda 520. I better check the link in the description to find out more details.
So by now, I'd like to think that we all know what Z690 gives us as far as a chipset goes. Support for the latest Alder Lake processors, DDR5 support, PCI Express 5.0, not that any devices support it yet, Wi-Fi 6E, and more and faster USB ports. So let's not stomp over old ground, but instead look at what NZXT have done to utilise these features, how the design has developed since the last generation, and what you, as an end user, get for your hard-earned cash. So typically in the past, NZXT have released one board per chipset and called it the N7. Generally speaking, it's featured a metal cover that aims to tie in with NZXT cases to fulfill that ecosystem, and has come in a choice of black or white. And with this latest chipset, nothing has changed, at least in that respect. But what is new is a completely new model called the N5. Now, while from a first glance it looks just like the N7, without the kind of armour plate, there's actually a bit more to it than that, and with the fact that there's a lot to go through for both boards, we'll timestamp this video so you can get to the parts you want much more easily. Now let's get packaging out the way first, as if you've ever had an NZXT board in the past or seen one of the boxes, then the Z690 range will look familiar. Inside, both boards come with pretty much the same stuff: a user guide, SATA cables, Wi-Fi antennas, and the relevant mounting hardware for your M.2 drives. Though the odd thing is, the N5 actually comes with one more screw, and you'll find out why later in this video. Now, when it comes to the board themselves, they're both ATX. They both look very similar, apart from the metal cover that the N7 has, and are both available in black or white. Now, even though the N5 doesn't include huge amounts of armour shielding, it still has quite a stealthy look and should still tie into any system quite nicely, especially if going for the kind of all black design. Now, one gripe that I did have with the B550 board that I hoped would have been addressed with the new Z690 board was the CMOS battery, which involved actually getting under the armour to remove it. But sadly, it seems my call fell on deaf ears. Though the N5 obviously gets around this simply by having the PCB exposed and easy access to the battery. I guess it's not too much of an issue, as again, the N7, much like the B550 board, does have a clear CMOS button on the rear I/O for those looking to troubleshoot any issues. So maybe I'm just being a little picky. Now, I don't want to hark on about Z690 as a chipset, as we know what that brings to the table, but what can these Z690 based boards do in terms of complementing those other components? Well, VRM wise, that all comes down to who you ask, because board manufacturers like to kind of brand them in different ways. But the N5 comes with 8 phases for the V-Core and 1 for the VCC GT, or iGPU. All 9 of these phases are made by Vishay and are rated at 50 amps each, and are all controlled by the Richtech RT3628AE dual channel PWM controller. On top of this, there is an extra phase for VCC in auxiliary, which helps assist other CPU related parts like the eCore's L2 cache and VCC SA, or system agent voltage. This part is actually set up on a high side and low side configuration using Sinopower MOSFETs, and are driven by an Anpec APW8828 single phase PWM controller, which is typically found on kind of more lower voltage components within notebooks. The N5 also uses solid capacitors across the whole VRM setup. The N7 changes it up a little bit with 12 phases for the V-core and 1 for the iGPU, and uses a combination of Vishay 50A and ON semiconductor 55A MOSFETs, which are all controlled under the ON NCP 81530 PWM controller, which we've seen featured on Gigabyte B660 boards in the past, so we know it's fairly good. Again, there is a single phase for the VCCSA, which utilises a dual N-channel MOSFET for the best efficiency, and is controlled by a low voltage single phase on NCP 81270 controller. There's also another single phase for the VCCIO0, which is generally used for high-speed I/O communication, and saw its inception start from Intel's 11th gen Rocket Lake processors. For this, NZXT use ON Vishay MOSFETs, and I'm guessing based on what they have available at the time of manufacturing dictates kind of which one they go with. Capacitor-wise, the N7 goes slightly beefier with Nichicon functional polymer black capacitors, which is actually very typical of what we've seen from ASRock-based boards in the past. And if you didn't know, that's who actually make these boards. So with the technical nitty-gritty out the way, obviously these kind of setups need to be kept cool, and NZXT have always been pretty good in this department. I mean, 50 or 55A phases generally are going to stay relatively cool in the grand scheme of things, especially when compared to other Z690 boards on the market, with 90 and 105A phases. I mean, it's crazy. And we will look at how things stack up in our testing very shortly. But let's talk about other features, and this is where it actually gets very interesting. The N5 actually has 4 M.2 slots, while the N7, which is the higher end and more expensive board of the two, only has 3. Now on both boards, the 3 M.2 slots are all Gen 4, whereas the full slot on the N5, which is on the rear of the board, like we'd see on a kind of ITX board, is only Gen 3. Why it's set out like this and why the N5 has a full slot is kind of weird, admittedly, and I don't see why they didn't do the same on the N7 as well, but I'm sure they have their reasons. In terms of expansion slots, both boards look very similar with 3 X16 physical slots, which on the N5 operate at Gen 5 X16, Gen 4 X4 and Gen 3 X1 speeds, as well as having 2 Gen 4 X1 slots. The N7 is kind of the same setup, though the third X16 slot operates at the slightly faster X4 speeds, and nestled between these slots is our Wi-Fi, 6E and Bluetooth module. On the rear I/O, both boards are very similar in terms of ports, just with a slightly different layout. We see an ample amount of USB ports, including USB 3.2 Gen 1 and 2 ports, as well as a Type-C port, and also some legacy USB 2.0 ports. There's also a single HDMI connector for those using a iGPU-based processor, Realtek 2.5G Ethernet and Realtek ALC 897 8-channel audio. Both boards also include a BIOS flashback button, while the N7 goes one step further with a clear CMOS button, likely because you can't get to that battery easily underneath that armour. So now the part of this video which for the most part is completely pointless. Benchmarking motherboards is a very simple thing to do, as all we really need to do is to compare it to other Z690 boards to see how it performs. And that mainly comes down to being in the same ballpark in each of our tests. Remember, a motherboard doesn't generally give extra performance and is more aimed at features and price. But for those of you who want to see them, let's get into it. But before we start, it's worth mentioning that for our tests, we tested with an Intel i9 12900K, along with 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum 3600MHz dual channel memory. GPU wise, we used the Gigabyte RTX 3080 Gaming OC, and for the sake of transparency, we used a Seagate FireCuda 530 2TB NVMe drive and Corsair RM1000X power supply. All tests were run on Windows 10 Pro 21H1 with NVIDIA driver 472.12. So starting with 3D Mark Firestrike, and both the N5 and N7 fall in line with where we'd expect in comparison to other boards, especially as it uses DDR4 opposed to DDR5 memory, which will make a ever so slight difference. In 3D Mark TimeSpy, we see very similar again, with the two boards hovering around the same performance as other DDR4 boards from both MSI and Asus, with the N7 just ahead of the cheaper N5 board. In PC Mark 10, the N7 gave us similar results to the other boards tested, albeit being the lowest by around 0.3%, while the N5 seemingly fell off a cliff. We obviously retested to see if it was an anomaly, but the results were consistent in this test. In Geekbench, while the boards are within the range that we'd expect, they did fall to the bottom of our chart when testing against other Z690 based boards in our single score test. As we move on to multi-core, the MSI Tomahawk DDR4 board falls to the bottom, but all still are within margin of error of one another. In W Prime 32M, again the N5 and N7 boards fell in line with where we'd expect them to be, so it's easy to say that both boards can keep up with the competition. As we move to 1024M, the N7 was a smidge quicker, but all within margin of error and comparative with other Z690 based boards. In our first web browser based test, the N7 actually came out on top, albeit by 1.06%. Again, it's good to sort of see that both NZXT boards showed no anomalies compared to similar boards from more established vendors. In Mozilla Kraken, we did see a slight issue with the N7 board. I mean, I see it as an issue, but I'm sure NZXT won't, as they came in with the fastest time. Retesting several times yielded the same result, and at the time of recording this, I'm still not quite sure as to why. In Web Expert, though the boards perform the worst, the difference between both the N5, N7 and other Z690 boards is negligible, and retesting could see the order shift around a bit. In 7-zip, the results again lined up where we expected, alongside other DDR4 based Z690 boards. The more expensive N7 based board gave us slightly better results, so it's good to know that spending extra money does give slightly increased performance here. In the decompression test, we saw results swap places a bit, but still saw the NZXT N5 and N7 boards fall in line with the Asus D4 board and MSI DDR4 Tomahawk board. Moving on to Corona 1.3, and while we did see the NZXT boards at the bottom of the stack, again, it's right where we'd expect it to be within a range of results for this test. In Cinebench R23, again, both boards fall within where we expect them to be in our single core based test, with the N7 edging ahead. In our multi-core test, things go a bit south, with the N7 board performing the worst by quite some margin. The N5, though it's at the bottom of our stack, is still within the range we'd expect it to be. As we move on to Ada 64 to see how memory performance stacks up, we again see both NZXT boards at the bottom. Again, the results fall within where we expect, and we could see a bit more performance with a BIOS update that could tweak some of the default RAM settings. As we move on to the copy test, the Asus and MSI boards fall down slightly, but the results are all still very similar. Looking at latency, and again, I feel that some of the default RAM values that are baked into the BIOS could be why the MSI and Asus DDR4 boards are just that little bit faster. In Unigen superposition, it's all much of a muchness, though the N5 did storm to the top of our charts, but when the difference between the highest and lowest score is a measly 1.4%, it's not really something to shout about. Gaming performance in Shadow of the Tomb Raider is where we see a slight variance between boards, and both NZXT boards outperform the competition when it comes to DDR4 based boards. Over 200 FPS though, it's not something you're ever really going to notice. In Metro Exodus, again, it's nice to see both boards performing in line with the other Z690 boards that we used for comparison, showing that NZXT have a product that can keep up with the competition. In World of Tanks, again, the NZXT boards fall in line with all the other boards, though again we see the N5 beating the N7 base board. Though with such similar results within a small margin of each other, it's not exactly a massive victory. So finally moving on to something that does mean something, and power consumption. At idle, the lesser N5 board was the most efficient Z690 board we've tested, with the N7 using around 16 watts more power at idle. At load, things seem to not go too well, with both NZXT boards being the most power-hungry boards we've tested on the Z690 platform. The cause of this is unknown, but being based on an ASRock design, it could be anything from a BIOS issue to some form of capacitor power issue, or something more related to the VRMs. It's something we've seen before with ASRock boards, so it wouldn't surprise me, but it is quite sad to see. Okay, so let's not dwell on performance. Like I said before we got into the charts, it's kind of a redundant metric, and I could have just as easily said that we tested in 20 odd different benchmarks and it passed them all. The end. When it comes to motherboard tests, it's always an interesting one because we have to look at ranges, which typically span 1% or 2%, and as long as it falls within that, it's good. That's really the simplicity of it. Where things do get interesting with motherboards comes down to features and pricing and what's right specifically for you as an individual. But there are two things that we can look at that separate boards even beyond that. The first thing being power consumption. I can only assume, as I've seen this before, that there is an issue within the BIOS, and it might be something I look into for our Patreons to see what went on and why we saw such a disparity. So if you want that, link is down below. The other area that I'll talk about here is VRMs. Now, we spoke about what they consist of, and while they aren't the beefiest setups in the world, they still require cooling. And as I mentioned, NZXT have always been pretty good in this department. And that shows too, with the N5 giving us an average idle temperature of 28.9 and load of 55.1 degrees. With this board and the N7, we strategically placed K-type thermocouple probes onto the stages closest to the V-Core's PWM controller. For the N7, the idle was an average of 32.6 with a load temperature of 49 degrees. So with both boards, there's no real cause for concern when it comes to VRM temperatures, and we still have plenty of headroom for overclocking or pushing your hardware even further. Now features, I can't comment on if that's right for you, as it all depends on what you're after from a motherboard, and if it fulfills the needs that you have. But both boards seem, let's say, pretty typical overall. A good amount of expansion, a decent amount of USB ports, though you will find the N5 only has one internal USB 2 header, which may cause some issue for some, but with most cases gearing more towards faster USB 3.2 ports, shouldn't really be much of a problem. I personally would have liked to have seen a few more USB ports on the rear I/O, and faster ones at that, but for the money, I get it, as more ports would need a secondary controller, and that would then consequently drive the cost up somewhat. Speaking of cost, the N5 is launching for $239.99 in the US and $209.99 in the UK, while the N7 is launching for $299 in the US and $269.99 in the UK, which puts the N7 right around the same price as the MSI Tomahawk DDR4, and if you look around, a smidge over the Asus TUF Gaming plus D4. The N5 is more comparative with some of the Prime boards from Asus and UD boards from Gigabyte, as well as MSI's Torpedo board. Sadly, I've not tested any of them or even had them in my hands, so right now it would be a bit unfair for me to make any sweeping comparisons at this time. But maybe we'll get them in the office in the future, so make sure you're subscribed for that. So what's the verdict? It's good from a design perspective. It's good from a unique point, and I've said that with every board NZXT has come out with, and I feel that that is the big selling point of the N7. The N5, even though it's cheaper, is a slightly more difficult sell, as while it ticks all the right boxes, I don't see any reason to buy it over something from the competition, other than the unique styling around the CPU socket and chipset, but it kind of starts and ends there. The big sticking point for me is the power consumption, and if I get any feedback from NZXT or their OEM ASRock, I'll be happy to give an update on our Twitter and in the comments on this video, so hopefully we maybe do get to the bottom of it. So there you have it. I'll let you make up your own mind. Has NZXT done enough? Either way, it's always nice seeing more variety in the market, so I'm not complaining when it comes to that. And with that, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing, and if you appreciate all the hard work that we put in, you can help support us over on Patreon. Again, link is down below. And let me know, what else would you like to see from motherboard videos? Because testing 20 odd benchmarks, to me, is just pointless. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.